All right, so in this lab, we're going to look at the prototype design pattern. The prototype design pattern is a creational design pattern that solves a commonly occurring problem where we need to clone an object and pass it to another component of our application instead of reinstantiating it or reconstructing it again. So the prototype design pattern is often used to create objects by cloning an existing object called a prototype, and we may use it whenever the process of recreating an instance is considered expensive or complicated. So we resolve to cloning this object. So we're going to look at creating a Java console application for a car auction service. And we're going to be using an API by the NHTSA, the US National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. This API is for car recalls. So we send the car make and model and year, and then we get the manufacturer recalls for this car. So we're going to be using this API. So we will have a Java console application. This is our client. We'll send an HTTP GET request to the endpoint recalls by vehicle to the API server. And the API server will return back a JSON response that we will deserialize and parse in Java. All right. So this is the API. If we're going to look at how to use this API, this is the documentation. So I'm going to copy this example and then send an HTTP GET request in the browser. And here we got the response. So we got the recalls in the results object. So this is a JSON object. And these are the summary. This is the summary of the recall, the components, and the airbag, frontal driver's side. And this basically is another recall. All right, so we get two recalls for this vehicle. It happens to be an Acura model RDX in 2012. Right, we can send any make or model or year to this API, and then we get the recall. So one way to play with this API is to use a tool called Postman. All right. So Postman is a tool for working with APIs, and we can use it to send an HTTP GET request and play with it. So I'm going to create a workspace here inside Postman. If you do not have Postman, you can download Postman. Just Google Postman. And then download the desktop application, or you can use even their just web application by logging in. So I'm going to create a workspace here inside Postman and make it personal. And I'm just going to send an HTTP GET request to this API. So I'm going to copy the API example, the URL. And then I'm going to put it in the URL field. And then I'm going to pass make, model, and model year as a query parameters. All right, so put the make, and then I'm going to put here Toyota. And then I'm going to put the model, put the Camry, and then the year, the model year, and then 2016, and then send an HTTP GET request, and we got the response in JSON, right? So we need to parse this response and deserialize it into a Java object, so that way we can work with it. All right. So we'll send an HTTP GET request to our client, and then we receive the response, and then we will parse the response and deserialize it in our Java application, right? So the process of converting JSON into an object is called deserialization. And if we want to convert an object into JSON, that's called serialization, right? So I'm going to use a third-party library to do this. It's called Jackson in this lab, and we will work with the deserialization part where we convert JSON into an object. All right. So it's back to the lab and check the objectives. Again, I'm going to work on the prototype design pattern. We're going to be using the HTTP client API in Java to send requests and retrieve the responses. Again, and then we're going to do the deserialization with JSON, right? So in this lab, we need at least JDK 11. This is because we're using the HTTP client API or class in Java, and this was introduced in Java 11, right? So if you try to run it in Java 8, you're not going to be able to, right? And this is again a Maven project, so you don't need to download the dependencies manually because they're all declared inside our Maven file. All right, so let's go to the getting started and click on your section and accept the assignment on GitHub Classroom. Right, we've been doing this so in the last two labs. So accept the assignment and then fork. It will fork the repository for you, so you can work on it to submit your lab. So I'm going to reload, and here I got my repo. So I'm gonna copy the HTTPS URL, and then I'm going to clone it. All right. So now we're cloning, git clone, and then I'm going to open it up in my IDE. So click Trust Project. So we open it up in the IDE. Let's take a look at the project structure, right? So we have our packages, and we have 5 classes here. This is the app class, the main class, and this is the car class, and this is our pom.xml, and make sure it's 11. It's not 1.11, it should be 11. And then you need to go to change or download the JDK if you don't have it. So you click File, and then click on Project Structure, and then go to the SDK under Project SDK, and try to find JDK 11 or above, right? If you have 18, it should work. If you don't, then download 11 or above. So I'm going to click on Add SDK, and then I'm going to be downloading JDK 11, right? So I'm going to select 11. This is from the Amazon Corretto project. So download it. This will download OpenJDK 11, and then click Apply and wait for the download to finish. You see the download progress here. So just give it some time until it has been downloaded. All right, so once downloaded, you need to right click on the pom.xml and select Maven, and then select Reload Project. Right, so getting an error because it's still downloading the JDK, so I'll give it some time and then I will try again. So it should work now. So right click Maven and then Reload Project. All right, and the error disappeared, so now we are good to work on this lab, right? And we even got the sync green check. So let's look at the car class. So the car class has a make, model, and year, and then has a list of recalls, right? So in the constructor, we do the initialization of these 3 except the recalls, right? So we initialize the make model year, but for the recalls, we're going to send an HTTP GET request to fetch the recalls, right? And then we initialize the recalls upon creating the object. All right. So in the fetch recalls, we're going to send an HTTP GET request to the make model and year, and then we will receive the response, and then we will be deserializing the response into our recall object, right? And we're going to look at the recall class, right? So that's how you send the request. So let's take a look at the recall class. In the recall class, you see that we have properties or fields with annotation. So this is used by the Jackson library. So at JSON property, this is what the field is called inside the JSON response, right? So some of them are annotated. If the field name is different than the response, then we need to annotate it, right? So if we go back to the response here, let's take a look at the results array. And then you see manufacturer starts with M capital. So that's why I had to put annotation for the manufacturer string. So private string manufacturer starts with M small case. And then in the response it's an M capital, so I had to do it that way, right? And then we also did it for the park it and park outside. We do not annotate them because they are exactly the same in the JSON file, right? You see the summary and component are slightly different, so that's why we added the annotation. We also had annotation for the date, right? And we want to parse it as a date, and then I put even the pattern for the report received date, right? So this is how this library works by using annotation. So at JSON property, and then you put the field inside the name of the field in the JSON response, right? So back to our diagram here, we're sending an HTTP GET request to the API server, and then we're receiving the response, and then we will do again deserialization, right? Because we will receive JSON, and we want to convert this JSON into a Java object. All right, so let's look at what our code will look like. So we have a car class, and then we have a list of recalls, right? So we'll fetch the recalls by sending an HTTP GET request to the API server, and then the API server is going to return a JSON response, right? So here, once we initialize the object car C1, we are going to send an HTTP GET request. So this will go to the constructor. Again, this is the what is happening in the main. So the blue code is in the main program. So it will send an HTTP GET request, and then when we initialize another object, car C2, it will send also another request, an HTTP GET request to the API server, right? So we don't want it to do this, so we don't want to send multiple requests, so we need to clone this instead of creating C2 again, right? C2 is needed by the recall viewer, which will show a table, right? We'll put the result in a table. So I want to pass a clone of the car object C1 to recall viewer instead of creating or reinstantiating or recreating another object, right? So I don't want to pass the same object because I don't want that component to mutate and change my object. So I want to give it a complete copy through cloning, right? So we want to clone the C1 instead of creating a new instance C2, right? So that's the purpose of this problem, right? And the use of this design pattern. So we want to do cloning here instead of creating another instance, all right? So let's take a look at how we can do this in code. All right, so if we go to the main class, we can see it. If we run it, building, and now it's fetching recalls from Netsa. It's hitting the network. So now we get the results in text, right? That's for calling system.out.println text. And then we sent another, you're going to see down another HTTP request. See, fetching recalls from Nessa because you instantiated C2, and that was passed to the recall viewer. The recall viewer will show it in a table, right? So we have two components. One will print out the results as is, and one will print in a table. When we create a new car object, we want to clone it and pass it to the one that will render this in a nice table format instead of recreating that object over and over again. Right, so we need to change this car C2 to, instead of using car C2 new car, we want to clone the object that we already instantiated in line 5. So car C2 equal C1.clone, right? And this is not going to work because still we have not implemented the clone functionality inside the car object, right? So it's fine. You're going to see this error, but we'll fix it. So let's save this main class and go to the car class. Now, when I go to the car class, Java has a built-in interface. We're going to implement it. That's called clonable. So this clonable interface will have the clone, right? So this is just like a marker where we mark this class that is clonable. So that means this class will override the clone method of the object class, right? So we'll implement the clone method. So this is going to return our object. So car clone. And then we're going to return a new object. So we will return a new object. So we return the make, model, and year, but we don't want to send another HTTP request, GET request. So we're not going to call this constructor that you see in line 16, because this constructor, if you see line 20, to create or send another HTTP GET request, right? So we're going to pass or create a new constructor, because we don't want this to send another HTTP GET request. So we don't want to call this constructor. So we're going to pass create another constructor. This can be even private, right? I'm going to make it public car. We'll take an object of car, and then we will initialize the make and model and year and recalls, right? So this make equals c.make, and this model equals c.model, and then we'll do the same for the year and the recalls, right? So this dot year equal c.year, and this dot recalls equal c.recalls, right? So that way we don't need to call the fetch recalls, right? Because if you call the fetch recalls, it will send another HTTP GET request, and then we basically didn't do any anything different than what we already did, right? So I'm gonna have the clone use that constructor. So I'm gonna say, hey, use me, the instance of this object, right? And then it will do the clone. So the clone now is working. So I think we should be good now. So let's run it. When we run it, we should only see fetching recalls once, right? So fetching recalls from Netsa stars should be only seeing this once because the object was cloned, which is great, right? So we see the results in text and then the results in table. We only see one fetching recalls from Netsa printed on the console, right? So we didn't create an object, so I'm going to delete that, and instead we cloned the object, right? So so this is how you implement the prototype design pattern. So I'm going to go and run my lab, and the lab will check if you implemented clonable, and if you clone the object is different than not not exactly the same object. Both are pointing to different objects. So let's run our test and see those two passing, the rest are running, and everything is passing. Great. So we got our test green passed. Now we need to push it, right? So I'm gonna get status. I see that I edited those two files, app.java and car.java. So I need to add them and stage them in my local Git repository, running git add on both files. And then we will commit them, right? So run git status. So these are staged, now ready to be pushed to GitHub. So git commit message, completed lab 3. And now I'm gonna push it. So git push origin main, right? So push successfully, great. So now let's go to the browser and check our repository. So let me reload. Right, so still running, right? Not complete. I'm gonna go to actions and wait for it to complete, right? So this should build and then run the test and then get the auto grading, right? If the test is, or if all tests are passing, then you should get the full grade. All right, so click on auto grading, green, that's great. That means we passed. The test has passed and the auto grader should grade this assignment. So let me just scroll all the way down. It's a long list of log messages. So scroll down till you see the green check marks. Great. So lab 3 test passed, all tests passed, and then points 100 out of 100, right? So so that's how you do this lab 3, and working with the prototype design pattern, right?